The diplomatic relationship between Canada and China appears to be on the mend after years of strain and a more recent escalation in trade tensions.
Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister will travel to China in a matter of weeks in a move that could signal an easing of tensions between the two countries locked in a diplomatic standoff.
Those discussions will deepen. I will expect at the appropriate time to be meeting with President Xi Jinping.
The diplomatic frost between Canada and China is beginning to thaw after years of freezing tension and a brutal escalation in trade warfare. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister is preparing to travel to China within weeks, a journey that could signal the end of a diplomatic standoff that's brought both nations to their knees. The promise hangs in the air. Those discussions will deepen. At the appropriate time, I will expect to be meeting with President Xi Jinping. But this isn't just another diplomatic mission. This is about survival. It started with a whisper, not a public statement, not a tweet, not even a calculated leak. Just a quiet message that slipped across the Pacific and landed on a polished desk in Ottawa, marked confidential and carrying a proposal so audacious it sounded like fiction. Beijing's ambassador had delivered what insiders are now calling the Golden Deal. The offer, a complete elimination of tariffs on Canadian agriculture. Every single one. Gone. Vanished. If, and only if, Canada agrees to lift its 100% import ban on Chinese electric vehicles. No phased approach, no multi-year framework, no bureaucratic dance, just a clean, brutal exchange. One signature, and nearly $5 billion worth of frozen Canadian exports could flow freely again within weeks. To some, it looks like salvation dropping from the sky. To others, it's a trap disguised as mercy. For years, Western Canada's farmlands have been suffocating under trade restrictions that feel more like punishment than policy. Canola fields that once shimmered gold under endless prairie skies now sit half-harvested, abandoned like crime scenes. Silos overflow with grain nobody wants to buy. The once constant hum of processing plants has faded into an eerie, unsettling silence. A market that once kept entire towns alive, from Saskatchewan to Manitoba, has been locked shut since early 2025. Then this offer arrived. A single lifeline from Beijing that could transform those ghostly fields into roaring engines of economic revival overnight. But beneath the spreadsheets and shipping forecasts lurks a far more dangerous question. Is this actually a trade deal, or is it a test of Canada's allegiance within the North American fortress? It's no secret that Ottawa marched in lockstep with Washington when Trump returned to the White House. Under immense pressure to stand shoulder to shoulder with the U.S., Canada imposed its own punishing 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, despite having virtually no direct stake in the automotive battle. The move wasn't about protecting Canadian manufacturers. It was pure solidarity, a political show of unity inside the fortress walls of North American trade. But the cost arrived with devastating speed. Within weeks, Beijing struck back with crushing duties designed to inflict maximum pain, 75.8% on raw canola, 100% on oil and meal, plus additional penalties targeting pork and seafood. The retaliation worked exactly as intended. Shipments slowed to a trickle. Warehouses filled beyond capacity. Farmers pleaded desperately for government subsidies just to keep their lights on. Now, China is essentially saying, remove your EV tariff and we'll remove ours. A perfectly mirrored offer, an unmistakable challenge, a dare. Across the prairies, the response has been immediate and raw with emotion. The premiers of Manitoba and Saskatchewan are publicly urging Ottawa to accept the deal. Let us sell again, they plead. Let us breathe. For rural communities bleeding out economically, this isn't some abstract policy debate playing out in boardrooms. This is about survival in its most fundamental form. A reopened Chinese market could send mile-long trains of canola rumbling eastward again, jump-starting frozen supply chains, re-energizing struggling local credit unions, and restoring the rhythm of life that trade once guaranteed. Economists conservatively estimate that simply lifting China's duties could inject billions of dollars back into Canada's western provinces almost immediately. But for every desperate voice demanding action, another rises in warning. What happens if accepting Beijing's terms shatters Canada's carefully maintained alignment with the U.S.? What if this single deal unravels decades of North American integration, painstakingly constructed under NAFTA and now USMCA? Inside Parliament Hill, the debate has turned fierce and deeply personal. Some lawmakers view the offer as a once-in-a-generation opportunity, a historic chance for Canada to prove it can act decisively in its own national interest without waiting for Washington's permission or approval. Others denounce it as naked economic blackmail, a calculated wedge designed to exploit Canada's simmering internal divide between East and West, between farms and factories, between those who sell abroad and those who build at home. One senior official, speaking strictly off the record, captured the stakes with brutal clarity. It's not about canola or cars. It's about control. It's about who gets to decide Canada's future. The story of how Canada arrived at this impossible crossroads begins a year earlier, when Trump announced sweeping tariffs on Chinese EVs. 100%, no exceptions, no negotiations. U.S. officials justified the move as necessary protection for American industry against an unstoppable wave of cheap, high-tech vehicles flooding global markets and threatening to drown domestic manufacturers. Canadian leaders, terrified of retaliation or being labeled unreliable partners, matched the American move almost overnight. But Washington offered nothing in return. Nothing. Instead, Trump's administration immediately began pushing for even harsher restrictions on Canada's own exports, going so far as to threaten penalties on Canadian auto parts if Ottawa didn't toe the line perfectly. For many Canadians watching from the sidelines, it felt sickeningly familiar, like reliving earlier decades when national policy seemed to be written in someone else's capital, for someone else's benefit. And then came Beijing's calculated backlash. When China's Commerce Ministry announced its counter-tariffs, it named Canadian canola, pork, and seafood with surgical precision. Products grown and processed thousands of kilometers away from Toronto or Montreal, yet suddenly dragged violently into a geopolitical standoff they had nothing to do with. Prairie farmers found themselves trapped in a war they never asked for, never started, and couldn't possibly win alone. Now Beijing's Golden Deal is transforming that war into a stark ultimatum. Accept our terms and the sanctions vanish overnight. Refuse, and the world's second-largest market stays sealed shut indefinitely. Possibly forever. For the premiers out west, the mathematics couldn't be simpler or more urgent. China once purchased nearly a quarter of all Canadian canola exports. That single trade relationship alone kept thousands of families afloat, and entire rural economies thriving with opportunity. A single handshake in Beijing could reopen that massive floodgate and restore prosperity within months. But in Ottawa, simplicity rarely survives its first brutal contact with geopolitics. Prime Minister Mark Carney now faces a dilemma that no leader would envy. Does he defend Ontario's robust, politically powerful auto sector, already deeply nervous about facing competition from China's sleek, impossibly low-cost electric vehicles? Or does he rescue the collapsing agricultural base that literally feeds the nation's western provinces and defines their economic identity? Either choice guarantees substantial pain. There is no clean victory here. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has already fired his opening warning shot across the bow, arguing forcefully that lifting the EV tariff would unleash a catastrophic wave of Chinese imports capable of crushing domestic manufacturers entirely. His province's auto industry directly supports tens of thousands of unionized, well-paying jobs, and its political weight in Canadian elections is absolutely enormous. Losing Ontario means losing power. Period. But on the other side of the country, patience has run completely dry. Saskatchewan's premier has openly and harshly criticized Ottawa's unquestioning loyalty to Washington, calling it a betrayal of common sense and Canadian interests. Local trade boards passionately echo that sentiment, describing the 100% EV tariff as a weapon pointed inward, one that protects absolutely no one while viciously punishing the very agricultural sectors that still keep Canada's export economy alive and competitive. Meanwhile, in forgotten towns like Brandon, Dauphin, and Leidminster, the human toll grows heavier each passing week. Silos overflow dangerously with mountains of unsold grain. Processing plants sit completely idle, their workers laid off indefinitely. Credit unions tighten lending standards as commodity prices continue their free fall. Young farmers seriously consider abandoning their family land for uncertain futures in distant cities. The proud agricultural backbone that once defined the prairies, that built communities and sustained generations, is now bending dangerously under relentless economic strain. And through it all, Beijing waits with infinite patience, watching carefully. To Chinese strategists playing the long game, Canada's canola isn't merely food or commodity. It's leverage of the highest order, a reliable plant protein alternative to vulnerable American soybeans, and a perfectly sized bargaining chip that fits seamlessly into China's broader grand strategy of securing clean, politically stable food sources immune to American pressure. Some international analysts have even begun calling this potential exchange the Green Trade Pact, a symbolically powerful swap of green energy technology for green agriculture, electric vehicles for renewable crops. On paper, the symmetry is elegant and almost poetic. In practice, it's politically explosive. Because what China is really offering Canada isn't simply market access or economic opportunity. It's offering a fundamental choice between dependence and independence, between honoring old alliances forged in different eras and embracing harsh new realities. And time is rapidly running out. Each month, the tariffs remain in place. The economic bleeding deepens across Western Canada. In Saskatchewan alone, exports to China have catastrophically plunged by 76%, collapsing to less than $100 million by late summer. Numbers that would have seemed impossible just years ago. Manitoba's pork producers report staggering annual losses exceeding $19 million, desperately forced to seek alternative buyers willing to pay far lower prices. For the first time in living memory, China, once proudly Canada's largest agricultural customer and most reliable market, has slammed its doors completely shut. Inside Ottawa's halls of power, every new statistic becomes another painful pressure point. Every farmer's angry protest becomes a sharp political reminder that the West is growing increasingly restless, increasingly willing to break ranks. The canola standoff has evolved beyond a mere economic crisis. It's rapidly morphing into a fundamental national identity test. The question haunting Parliament tonight: how much is Canada truly willing to sacrifice to maintain perfect alignment with the United States? And how long before that tested loyalty finally begins to crack under the mounting weight of regional desperation and fury? Across the border, meanwhile, the story unfolds in haunting reverse. While Canada's prairies wait anxiously for the distant sound of freight trains to roll again, America's once thriving farmlands are falling into devastating silence. For decades, China was the single biggest buyer of U.S. soybeans, reliably purchasing nearly half of all American exports year after year. That trade alone was worth well over $12 billion in 2024, a lifeline for entire states. But by the brutal summer of 2025, it had vanished completely. In the newest export season, not a single Chinese order materialized. Zero. Nothing. The massive ports that once shipped millions of tons of premium Midwestern soy now stand eerily quiet, their towering cranes motionless, their cavernous warehouses half-lit like abandoned monuments. Farmers across Iowa, Illinois, and Nebraska, who built their entire business models around those dependable Chinese sales, are now watching helplessly as their harvests literally rot in storage. Worthless. According to detailed Financial Times reporting, Brazil has aggressively stepped in to fill the gaping void, seizing nearly three-quarters of China's colossal soybean market and effectively pushing American producers completely out of one of their most historically lucrative agricultural arenas. The U.S. Department of Agriculture estimates with grim precision that this rupture is costing American farmers over $9 billion annually. Wealth simply evaporating. Small towns across the Midwest are feeling the devastation directly. Cascading layoffs, mounting bankruptcies, and a growing bitter anger that the trade war supposedly designed to make America strong again is now bleeding its agricultural heartland completely dry. And in that massive vacuum of American weakness, Canada suddenly finds itself standing at an unexpected crossroads of opportunity. China's deliberate pivot away from U.S. suppliers has created a rare, possibly unique opening, a genuine chance for Canadian farmers to dramatically regain their footing as Beijing's trusted, preferred suppliers. Beijing's intense interest in canola isn't only about cooking oil or animal feed anymore. It's fundamentally about diversification, about methodically building a stable, resilient food supply chain completely independent of unreliable American exports and political pressure. In a transformed world where trust and consistency are now infinitely more valuable than rock-bottom prices, Canada's hard-earned reputation as a predictable, rules-based partner could become its most powerful currency in global trade. But seizing that golden opportunity means making a decision Washington absolutely will not like. A decision that could reshape North American relations for a generation. In Ottawa, the Prime Minister's office has quietly become the stage for an intense, silent tug-of-war that will define Canada's future. On one end stand the desperate Western premiers, arguing with increasing urgency that the economically devastating EV tariff is actively destroying livelihoods and must be eliminated immediately. On the opposite end, Ontario's powerful industrialists, influential unions, and connected lobbyists are issuing stark warnings that removing the tariff could catastrophically open the floodgates to overwhelming Chinese competition. Cars that are cheaper, cleaner, and technologically more advanced than anything North American factories are remotely prepared to produce competitively. Prime Minister Mark Carney stands trapped at the center of this impossible storm, listening carefully to both sides, acutely aware that whatever choice he ultimately makes could define not only his personal political legacy, but Canada's entire global position and identity for decades to come. Doug Ford has already made his uncompromising stance crystal clear. The Ontario Premier has publicly called any move to lift the protective EV tariff economic suicide, warning ominously that aggressive Chinese automakers like BYD and Geely are poised and ready to immediately flood Canadian showrooms with impossibly low-cost electric vehicles the moment restrictions fall. Ford argues passionately that the massive auto industry centered in Windsor, Oshawa, and Oakville represents Canada's industrial soul and economic backbone, and that abandoning it would be an unforgivable betrayal of Ontario workers and Canadian manufacturing pride. The clock is ticking, the pressure is mounting from all sides, and Canada must choose loyalty or survival, alliance or independence, the past or an uncertain future. The world is watching, and Beijing is waiting.
If you enjoyed the video, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos.